Hello, I'm speaking to you on a day called Corpus Christi, a day which the Church invites us to celebrate with thanksgiving the gift of Holy Communion, the Eucharist. It's a day that's very much observed within the Catholic tradition, often with elaborate ceremonial. And even for those of us who don't necessarily observe it in that way, it's nevertheless a day to be really grateful to God for that great invitation he extends to us in the Eucharist, in communion, whether we celebrate it with elaborate ceremonial or with great simplicity. And yet, in these days, it's a rather poignant and ironic day, because one thing that we're not able to do is to gather together in our churches to celebrate communion. I've just done a little calculation in my own parish, which is a parish that is centred on the practice of the Eucharist. I think we have now missed 44 separate scheduled celebrations, most of them in St Chad's Church building, but also in Elmhurst Mission and occasionally one or two other places. 44 times when, in normal circumstances, groups of people would have gathered together around the Lord's table. And we're not able to do that. And we miss it. Some of us miss it grievously. We lament the absence of communion. And it's as if we're on a journey, as if we're pilgrims. Lichfield is a city with a pilgrimage history, a very rich and strong one. It was one of the major medieval pilgrimage sites in England, as the shrine of St Chad was set up where the cathedral now is. Pilgrims travelled many miles, experienced many hardships, because they had a vision of a goal, to visit the shrine of St Chad, one of the holiest leaders the Christian Church, certainly in Mercia, in this part of what is now England, had experienced. And I think that image of pilgrimage is a very helpful one for us as we journey through the different phases of lockdown, as we experience our own hardships, our own sense of being deprived, being denied something special, something that feeds us. And like those medieval pilgrims, we too need a vision, the vision of the time when we can gather together again. We are moving closer to it, but it will be different. And pilgrims had to take one step at a time to move towards the celebration. But today we give God thanks for the gift of communion, because that's what it is, a gift. It's an invitation from a gracious and generous God to share in that great symbolic reality that points to everything that God's done for us, for all that God's life signifies for us, in Jesus Christ, who is the image of the invisible God. It's a gift. It's also a command. Jesus said, do this. And so it's frustrating that we currently can't. We can't do it in its fullness as a gathered community. But it's also an effectual sacrament. It effects what it signifies. It generates and creates the unity of the church. I remember saying to somebody once who was asking me about my church, I remember saying, the thing that holds us together, the thing that generates our unity is that we gather in the Eucharist, we gather at the Lord's table. And at the moment we cannot. And we lament that. But we anticipate as pilgrims the day when we will be able to join again. Maybe in smaller numbers, maybe in less elaborate celebrations, but we will gather at the Lord's table. And the Lord's table we tend to use at St Chad's is a rather interesting one. It's a table that was made in the year 1658. It has the date on it inscribed. It's a very simple table. But it's significant because 1658 was right in that period after the English Civil War, before the restoration of the monarchy, where England was ruled by a protectorate. It was the year Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, died, and Richard Cromwell took over. It was only a matter of years before the whole experiment failed. But it's significant that we celebrate the Eucharist on a holy table from that period. It was a period when the established church became Presbyterian. Bishops were abolished. Many of the ceremonies and sacraments and rites that we currently enjoy and we enjoyed before were abolished. It was a time of transition. It was a radical experiment. But it masked a bloody history, because in the English Civil War, St. Chad's as a church was taken over by the parliamentary forces. They used it to stable their horses, their artillery, their weapons. And there is still, even today, in the fabric of the church, signs of damage from musket fire. Not because the church was ever besieged, but because it was used for target practice. And what is definitely true is that it's from St. Chad's that parliamentary soldiers went on their forays to besiege the cathedral when it was held in royalist hands. In fact, one of those sieges, the very first one, took place on St. Chad's Day in, I think, the year 1645. I've always found that a chilling thought, because we sit on a divided history. Our history is wounded, and yet the Eucharist is a healing sacrament. It points to our unity in Christ. And so I'm very conscious that when I preside at the Eucharist in St. Chad's on a holy table dated 1658, that part of what I'm doing is, yes, to build the church here and now and for the future, but maybe it's also to cover the sins of the past. Communion is a powerful thing. Over the next couple of weeks, I will post on this YouTube channel several reflections on the Eucharist. Some of them will be biblical. Some will reflect on the Eucharist as a healing grace, because I think it's effectual. I think there is nothing better we can do to deal with our wounds. And we wait and look forward to that time when we can gather together in St. Chad's, a church with a troubled past because of the Civil War, but a church which points to what a life of holiness, as exemplified in our founder Chad, what that life can do to bring reconciliation and wholeness. I want to end this opening reflection with two readings. The first one is a reading from a scholar called Gregory Dix, a mid-20th century scholar who wrote a classic work on communion called The Shape of the Liturgy, in which he analyses the historical development of communion. But in this reading, he simply and lyrically shares the impact of communion. Was ever another command so obeyed? For century after century, spreading slowly to every continent and country, and among every race on earth, this action has been done. In every conceivable human circumstance, for every conceivable human need, from infancy and before it, to extreme old age and after it, from the pinnacles of earthly greatness to the refuge of fugitives in the caves and dens of the earth. Men have found no better thing than this to do for kings at their crowning, and for criminals going to the scaffold, for armies in triumph, or for a bride and bridegroom in a little country church, for the proclamation of a dogma, or for a good crop of wheat, for the wisdom of the parliament of a mighty nation, or for a sick old woman afraid to die, for a schoolboy sitting an examination, or for Columbus setting out to discover America, for the famine of whole provinces, or for the soul of a dead lover. One could fill many pages with the reasons why men have done this and not tell 100th part of them. And best of all, week by week and month by month, on 100,000 successive Sundays, faithfully, unfailingly across all the parishes of Christendom, the pastors have done this just to make the plebs sancta Dei, the holy common people of God. We have a pause in that tradition, but the day will come when again the holy common people of God, you and me, will be remade in the Holy Eucharist. As we tread on our pilgrim journey, as we take steps towards that day, we wait with that vision, with that hope, and it will be a blessed time. And when we do so in St. Chad's, we will do so on a holy table made in 1658. And I'm going to end this reflection with a poem written by Malcolm Guite called This Table. It's a poem he has shared as part of his Corpus Christi reflections today. And it evokes what we're doing and where it takes us as we celebrate communion. The centuries have settled on this table, deepened the grain beneath a clean white cloth, which bears afresh our changing elements. Year after year of prayer in hope and trouble were poured out here and blessed and broken, both in aching absence and in absent presence. This table too the earth herself has given and human hands have made, where candle flame at corners burns and turns the air to light. The oak once held its branches up to heaven, blessing the elements which it became, rooting the dew and rain, branching the light. Because another tree can bear unbearable for us the weight of love, so can this table. Because another tree can bear unbearable for us the weight of love, so can this table. For in the Eucharist, at the holy table, we share the Lord's death. We proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. But we proclaim too his resurrection from the dead, his life. As we journey towards the celebration of communion once again, may we do so in hope, in faith, and in love, to the glory of Christ. Amen.